The observation station at the edge of the Velhari disputed zone was old. It had been floating in the cold dark for nearly 200 years, watching three empires tear each other apart over a handful of star systems that nobody truly needed. The sensors on that station had recorded thousands of battles, millions of deaths, and enough weapons fire to melt a small moon. The crew who worked there had seen everything. Or so they thought. The sensor officer on duty that night was a young Javari named Palith. She had 4 arms, compound eyes the color of dark amber, and a habit of humming quietly when her shift got boring. She was humming now, watching the same old patterns on her screens. The Velhari hegemony fleet held the northern quadrant. The Drunari packed fleet circled from the west. The Sithon communion lurked in the shadow of a gas giant, waiting for the other two to weaken each other before they would strike. It was the same dance they had been doing for 400 years. Then her screens went white. Palith stopped humming. She tapped the console. She tapped it again. The readings made no sense. There was an energy signature appearing at the center of the disputed zone, but it was not like any hyperspace entry she had ever seen. Normal hyperspace entries were smooth, clean. A ship would slide through the fabric of space like a needle through cloth, leaving barely a ripple. This was not smooth. This was not clean. This was a wound. Space itself seemed to crack open like broken glass. Radiation alarms screamed across every frequency. The 3 alien fleets, locked in their endless battle, all stopped firing at the same moment. Every sensor on every ship in the zone pointed at the same spot. Stars in the local cluster flickered and bent, as if the universe itself had flinched away from whatever was coming through. And then it came through. The ship that emerged from the tier in reality was unlike anything the galaxy had ever recorded. It was enormous, 4.7 kilometers from bow to stern, built like a black iron fist, scarred and burned along its hull as if it had already fought a dozen wars before arriving. It ran dark. No lights. No identification beacons. No energy signature except the dull, angry glow of massive forward-facing weapons that pulsed like a slow heartbeat. It was a Terran warship, the TWS Erebus, a dreadnought-class vessel of the Terran Dominion. Palith stared at her screens. Her 4 hands were shaking. She opened a channel to the station commander with a voice that did not sound like her own. "Sir, you need to see this." Across the disputed zone, on a diplomatic cruiser that had been observing the war from a safe distance, Ambassador Thesic Valron of the Javari Diplomatic Corps received the same sensor data. He was old. Very old. He had served the Galactic Concordance for 312 years. He had negotiated treaties between species that breathed fire and species that lived in the vacuum of space. He had seen wonders and horrors in equal measure. But when he saw the sensor profile of the Erebus, his blood turned to ice. Humanity was supposed to be contained. That was the word the Concordance used. Contained. It sounded clean and reasonable in council chambers, but what it really meant was caged. 2 centuries ago, when humanity first made contact with the wider galaxy, the Concordance had taken one look at their history and recoiled. A species that had split the atom and immediately used it to burn 2 of its own cities. A species that had invented the internet and used it to spread hatred as fast as knowledge. A species that had nearly destroyed its own planet before it even left its solar system. The Concordance had decided that humanity was too dangerous to be allowed into the galactic community. They were denied access to the Hyperspace Gate network. They were denied trade routes, resource rights, and territorial claims beyond their home system. Monitoring stations were placed around their solar system to make sure they stayed put. And for 200 years, humanity had been quiet. Too quiet, Thesic realized now. He had written reports about it. He had warned the Council that silence from a species like humanity was not peace, it was preparation. Nobody had listened. Now the Erebus hung in the center of the disputed zone like a dark monument, and the silence from its hull was louder than any weapon. The broadcast came 30 seconds after the ship fully emerged. It was transmitted on every known frequency, in every known galactic language, with perfect grammar and pronunciation. The translation was flawless, which meant humans had been listening to galactic communications for a very long time. The message was short. This system is now under Terran protection. All hostile military operations will cease within 12 hours. Failure to comply will result in the use of force. There will not be a second warning. For a moment, nothing happened. The three alien fleets floated in silence, processing what they had just heard. One single ship had just told three galactic empires to stop a war that had been going on longer than most species had been in space. Then the laughter started. The Velhari High Commander, a massive armored creature named Goreth Sen, actually laughed out loud on an open channel. The Drunari Fleet Admiral made a crude joke about human arrogance. Even the Sithon, who were usually quiet and calculating, allowed themselves a moment of amusement. One ship against hundreds. Ambassador Thesic did not laugh. He sat in his quarters on the diplomatic cruiser and stared at the sensor readings of the Erebus, and he felt something he had not felt in a very long time. He felt afraid, not of the ship itself, though it was terrifying. He was afraid because he was the only person in the entire zone who understood what it meant that humanity had built it. They were supposed to be primitive. They were supposed to be stuck in their little solar system, arguing among themselves. They were not supposed to have ships that could tear open hyperspace without using the Concordance Gate network. That technology did not exist. The greatest minds of 100 species had said it was impossible. Humanity had done it anyway. On the bridge of the Erebus, Captain Idris Marin stood with her hands clasped behind her back and watched the tactical display. She was tall and lean, with dark skin, close-cropped silver hair, and eyes that had seen too many things to be surprised by alien warships. She had been born on Mars, raised during the resource riots, and had served in the Terran military for 26 years. She did not smile often. She was not smiling now. Her executive officer, Commander Anil Reeves, stepped up beside her. He was younger, broader, with nervous energy that he kept tightly controlled. He looked at the display showing 600 alien warships surrounding their position and swallowed hard. "Captain, they are not taking us seriously." Marin watched the alien fleet formations on her screen. She watched the Velhari already beginning to regroup. She watched the Drunari positioning their heaviest ships in an attack pattern. She watched the Sithon pulling back to observe, which told her that at least one of these species was smart. "They will," she said quietly. Reeves hesitated. "Should we begin combat preparations?" Captain Marin shook her head slowly. She looked at the countdown timer she had placed on the main display. 11 hours and 58 minutes remained. "No," she said, "we wait. Let them have their 12 hours. Let them talk and plan and feel confident." She turned to look at her XO with those calm, unreadable eyes. "They are already in a fight, Commander. They just do not know that we have joined it yet." The stars outside the bridge viewport seemed to tremble, still unsettled from the violence of the Erebus arrival. In the distance, alien warships moved like schools of fish, circling, uncertain, laughing at the lone dark giant in their midst. They would not be laughing for long. 6 hours into the countdown, the Velhari hegemony lost its patience. High Commander Goreth Sen was not a creature built for waiting. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, covered in thick gray plates of natural armor that his species had evolved over millions of years. His ancestors had been apex predators on a heavy gravity death world, and Goreth carried that legacy in every step he took. He had conquered 11 star systems personally. He had crushed rebellions with his bare hands. He did not take orders from anyone, least of all from some pale, soft-skinned species that had crawled out of the mud only a few thousand years ago. He assembled a destroyer squadron, 42 warships, each one bristling with plasma, torpedo launchers, and neutron lance batteries. It was enough firepower to crack the crust of a small planet. He aimed them directly at the Erebus and gave the order to advance. On the bridge of the Erebus, the tactical officer reported the incoming formation. Captain Marin did not move from her command chair. She did not raise shields. She did not power weapons. She simply watched. Commander Reeves stood beside her, tension visible in every line of his body. "Captain, 42 ships inbound, attack formation, weapons hot." "I see them." "Orders?" "None." Reeves opened his mouth, closed it, and gripped the railing in front of him. Around the bridge, the crew of the Erebus worked their stations with the quiet focus of people who had trained for this exact moment for years. Nobody panicked. Nobody raised their voice. The ship simply waited, dark and silent, like a stone in the path of a river. The Velhari destroyers closed to 40,000 kilometers. At that range, their weapons were at maximum effectiveness. Goreth Sen, watching from his flagship at the rear of the formation, gave the command to fire. The void lit up. 42 ships fired at once. Plasma torpedoes streaked across the darkness in bright orange lines, hundreds of them, each one carrying enough energy to melt through a kilometer of solid rock. Neutron lances, invisible beams of focused radiation that could cook a crew alive inside their own hull, sliced through space alongside them. It was a coordinated barrage designed to overwhelm any known defense system in the galaxy. Every shot hit the Erebus, and every shot was absorbed. The Erebus did not shake, it did not buckle, it did not even drift from its position. The entire barrage struck a shimmering barrier of energy that appeared around the ship's hull like a second skin, rippled once with a faint blue glow, and then went still. The barrier was not a standard shield. Standard shields flickered and strained under fire. This barrier simply ate the energy and asked for more. Across the disputed zone, sensor officers on every ship stared at their readings in disbelief. The Concordance observation station recorded the impact data and automatically flagged it as a sensor malfunction, because no known technology could do what they had just witnessed. Ambassador Thesek Valron watched from his cruiser and felt his worst fears confirmed. He had studied human scientific papers for decades, the ones they published openly, the ones the Concordance considered too primitive to be worth classifying. He remembered reading about something called adaptive energy absorption. The human researchers had written about it in careful, boring academic language, the way they always did when they were working on something terrifying. They had figured it out. They had actually figured it out. On the bridge of the Erebus, Captain Marin let the silence stretch for 3 full seconds after the barrage ended. She wanted the Velhari to understand what had just happened. She wanted them to look at their weapons' readings and see the zeros where damaged numbers should have been. Then she spoke. "Respond proportionally." The weapons officer touched a single control on her console. One forward rail battery powered up. The Erebus carried 28 of these weapons, massive electromagnetic accelerators that ran the entire length of the ship's spine. Only one fired. The round left the barrel at a fraction of the speed of light. It crossed 40,000 kilometers in less than a heartbeat. It struck the lead Velhari destroyer dead center. The destroyer's shields, which were considered among the strongest in the hegemony fleet, lasted approximately 1/10 of a second. The round punched through them like they were made of paper. It entered the ship through the forward hull, passed through the reactor compartment, exited through the rear hull, and continued on in a straight line until it struck the second destroyer in the formation and tore through that one as well. 2 ships, 1 round, both dead in the water, venting atmosphere and fire into the void. The remaining 40 Velhari destroyers broke formation instantly. It was not an organized retreat. It was panic. Ships turned in every direction, engines burning at maximum, trying to put as much distance between themselves and the Erebus as physically possible. Goreth Sen roared orders at his captains, but nobody was listening anymore. Captain Marin watched them run. She did not order a pursuit. She did not fire again. One shot was enough to make the point. In the hours that followed, the balance of power in the disputed zone shifted in ways that no one could have predicted. The Drunari Pact, who had been preparing their own attack run, quietly stood down and began pulling their heavier ships to the rear of their formation. Their fleet admiral was ambitious but not stupid. She had seen what one shot from that ship could do, and she had no desire to learn what 28 shots would look like. The Sithon Communion did something more interesting. They sent a diplomatic shuttle toward the Erebus, carrying their senior envoy, a tall and thin creature with silver skin and 4 black eyes that reflected no light. The Sithon were the thinkers of the 3 empires. While the Velhari relied on brute force and the Drunari on numbers, the Sithon survived through intelligence and manipulation. They recognized power when they saw it, and their first instinct was always to align themselves with it. The shuttle requested permission to dock. Captain Marin denied it. "Inform the Sithon envoy that we are not here to negotiate alliances," she told her communications officer. "We are not here to pick a side. We are here to end this war, all sides, equally." The Sithon shuttle hung in space for a long moment, then turned and flew back to its fleet. On board, the envoy sat in silence, processing something it had not expected. Humans were not interested in playing the game. They had come to flip the table. Meanwhile, on the Concordance capital world of Axiom Prime, a storm was building. The sensor data from the disputed zone had been transmitted at faster-than-light speeds through the Concordance communication network, and within hours, every major species in the galaxy knew what had happened. A human ship had appeared from nowhere, shrugged off the best weapons the Velhari had, and crippled 2 warships with a single shot. Ambassador Thesic was already composing his emergency report to the High Council. His hands trembled as he wrote, not from fear of the Erebus itself, but from the implications of its existence. The Concordance had locked humanity in their solar system for 200 years. They had denied them resources, technology, trade, and territory. They had treated them like dangerous animals in a cage. And in that cage, humanity had built something that no species in the galaxy could match. Thesic thought about human history, which he had studied more carefully than anyone on the council. He thought about how humans had spent 10,000 years fighting each other with increasing creativity and violence. He thought about how every time someone tried to contain them or limit them, they found another way forward. He thought about how the splitting of the atom, the darkest moment in their history, had also given them the power to reach the stars. The Concordance had made a terrible mistake. They had tried to cage the one species in the galaxy that treated cages as motivation. Back on the Erebus, the countdown timer on the main display continued to tick. 5 hours and 23 minutes remained. Captain Marin sat in her command chair and reviewed the tactical data from the brief engagement. 2 ships disabled. No confirmed casualties. The Velhari crews were alive, picked up by their own rescue ships. That was important. That was the entire point. Commander Reeves approached her again, more confident now but still cautious. "The Velhari and Drunari fleets are communicating with each other, Captain. Encrypted channels. Our signals team is already working on decryption, but the pattern suggests they are discussing a joint operation." Marin nodded slowly. She had expected this. Hit one bully and the others gang up. It was the same on every playground in the universe. "How many ships between them?" "Roughly 600 combat-capable vessels, Captain." 600 against 1. On paper, it was a death sentence. Captain Marin looked at those numbers and felt something she would never admit to her crew, not fear, something quieter, something like sadness. She had hoped the demonstration would be enough. She had hoped one shot would make them understand, but some lessons needed to be taught twice. "Let them come," she said, "and begin pre-deployment checks on the Vanguard systems." Reeves paused. The Vanguard had never been used in actual combat before. It had only been tested in the deep black of Terran space, far from any watching eyes. Using it here would reveal one of humanity's most closely guarded military secrets to the entire galaxy. Captain, are you sure? Once we deploy the Vanguard, everyone will know what we have. Marin looked at him with those steady, ancient eyes. That is the point, Commander. Everyone needs to know. The countdown continued. Outside, 600 alien warships were gathering like wolves. Inside the Erebus, something was waking up. On Axiom Prime, the capital world of the Galactic Concordance, the emergency session of the High Council began with shouting and did not get quieter from there. The council chamber was a massive circular hall carved from living crystal deep beneath the surface of the planet. It had been built 8,000 years ago by a species that no longer existed, and it had hosted the debates and decisions of galactic civilization ever since. Tiered seats rose in concentric rings around a central platform, and each seat was designed to accommodate a different body type, because the concordance included species that ranged from insectoid to gaseous to crystalline. On a normal day, the chamber hummed with quiet diplomacy. Today it roared. Councillor Dreth Morvan stood at the center platform, his heavy reptilian tail slamming against the floor for emphasis as he spoke. He was Korvathi, a species built for war and argument in equal measure. His scales were dark green, his teeth were visible even when his mouth was closed, and his voice could fill a room without any amplification. "One ship," he growled, pointing at the holographic display that floated above the platform showing the Erebus in the disputed zone. "One ship, and you all sit here trembling like hatchlings in a storm. The answer is simple. We mobilize the Concordance combined fleet, 12,000 warships. We go to the disputed zone. We destroy this human toy, and we remind this species what happens when you challenge the established order of the galaxy." Murmurs of agreement rippled through parts of the chamber. The Korvathi delegation stamped their feet in support. Several other militaristic species joined them, but the murmurs died quickly because the display was still showing the sensor data from the Velhari engagement, and everyone in the chamber had watched a single human weapon punch through two warships like a needle through cloth. Elder Counselor Vashan, a gaseous being from the Nethuri species who appeared as a slowly rotating cloud of pale blue light within a containment suit, spoke next. Its voice was soft and carried the weight of a species that had been in the Concordance for 6,000 years. Counselor Morvan proposes that we send 12,000 ships to destroy one. I ask him to consider what this says about us. I also ask him to consider what happens if we send 12,000 ships and fail. Morvan's scales flushed darker. We would not fail. The Velhari thought the same thing 3 hours ago. The chamber erupted again. Arguments flew between species. Old grudges resurfaced. The Korvathi accused the Nethuri of cowardice. The Nethuri accused the Korvathi of stupidity. A small delegation of silicon-based Grethar simply vibrated at a frequency that their translators interpreted as deep concern. Through all of this, Ambassador Thesic Valron sat in the observer gallery and waited for his turn to speak. He had been summoned directly from the disputed zone via the fastest courier ship the Concordance had, and he had not slept in 2 days. His compound eyes were dull with fatigue, but his mind was sharp. He had spent the entire journey preparing what he needed to say. When the council speaker finally called his name, the chamber went quiet. Everyone knew Thesic. He was the oldest living diplomat in the Concordance. He had personally negotiated more treaties than most species had fought wars. When Thesic spoke, even the Korvathi listened, though they would never admit it. He walked slowly to the center platform. He was smaller than most of the counselors, his insectoid body fragile-looking compared to the armored bulk of the Korvathi or the towering frames of the Velhari observers. But his voice, amplified by the chamber's systems, was steady and clear. "I have spent the last 30 years assigned to the Human Monitoring Program," he began. "I have read their transmissions. I have studied their culture. I have watched them through our observation stations. and I have written 47 reports to this council warning that our containment strategy was failing. Every single one of those reports was filed, acknowledged, and ignored." He paused and let the silence do its work. "You called them primitives. You pointed to their history of war and self-destruction and told yourselves that they were too dangerous and too stupid to be allowed into the galactic community. You locked them in their solar system and you forgot about them. And while you forgot, they did not sleep." He gestured to the holographic display, which was now showing a technical readout of the Erebus. "This ship does not use our hyperspace gate network. Humanity built their own method of faster-than-light travel. Our best physicists said this was impossible without access to concordance gate technology. Humanity did it in less than a century. This ship carries adaptive energy shielding that absorbed a full Velhari barrage without a single point of failure. Our weapons engineers have no record of this technology in any species arsenal. And this ship carries rail-based kinetic weapons that punch through the strongest shields in the galaxy like they do not exist." He turned slowly, meeting the eyes of as many counselors as he could. "They built all of this alone, in a single star system, with no help, no trade, and no access to the resources that every other spacefaring species takes for granted. They did it because we gave them no choice, and they did it because that is what humans do. When you push them, they do not break, they build." Counselor Morvan's tail had stopped moving. He was staring at the technical readout with an expression that was no longer angry. It was something closer to unease. Thesic continued, "I want to tell you something about human history that most of you do not know because most of you never bothered to learn. 200 years before they made contact with us, humans split the atom. It was the most powerful energy source they had ever discovered. And the very first thing they did with it was build a weapon and use it on 2 of their own cities. Hundreds of thousands of their own people, burned alive in an instant." The chamber was completely silent now. Any other species would have collapsed after that. Any other species would have retreated from that technology in horror. Humans did the opposite. They took that same power and used it to light their cities, heal their sick, and eventually drive the first ships that carried them beyond their world. They took the worst thing they had ever created and turned it into the foundation of their future. That is not the behavior of primitives. That is the behavior of something far more dangerous. That is adaptation under pressure. That is a species that treats every disaster as a blueprint. He stepped back from the center of the platform. "The Erebus is not a threat to the Concordance. It is a message. Humanity is telling us that the cage did not work. And now we need to decide how we respond, not with weapons, but with wisdom. Because if we go to war with a species that turns every obstacle into fuel, we will lose. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually, because they will not stop. They never stop." The silence that followed Thesic's speech lasted nearly a full minute. In the High Council of the Galactic Concordance, that was an eternity. Far away in the disputed zone, the 12-hour deadline expired. Captain Marin stood on the bridge of the Erebus and watched the clock reach 0. Outside, the combined Velhari-Drunari armada had assembled. 600 warships in a formation that stretched across thousands of kilometers of space. The two empires had set aside their 400-year hatred of each other for the simple reason that they hated the humans more. Goreth Sen had taken personal command of the combined fleet, and his flagship, the hegemony dreadnought Unbroken Fist, led the formation. The Sithon Communion had quietly pulled their entire fleet behind the gas giant and gone dark. They were watching, calculating, and waiting to see who won before choosing a side. Smart, Marin thought. At least someone in this sector had sense. Commander Reeves reported from the tactical station. 612 combat vessels, mixed formation, heavy capital ships at the center, destroyers and frigates on the flanks. They are advancing at combat speed, weapons charged, estimated engagement range in 4 minutes. Marin nodded. She had hoped it would not come to this. She had given them 12 hours, a single demonstration, and every chance to back down. It was not enough. It was never enough with the stubborn ones. "Deploy the vanguard," she said. The order traveled through the ship like an electric current. Deep in the belly of the Erebus, in hangars that ran the full length of the vessel's interior, lights turned from red to green. Magnetic clamps released. Launch rails powered up. And the dorsal ridge of the Erebus, that long dark spine that ran along the top of the ship, began to split open. From inside they poured out 200 autonomous combat drones, each one the size of a small warship, black and angular, and moving with a speed and coordination that no living pilot could match. They did not fly in formation. They flew in a pattern that shifted and adapted in real time, spreading across the void like a swarm of wasps. On the sensor screens of every ship in the combined armada, the single contact labeled Erebus suddenly became 201 contacts, and the tactical calculations that had seemed so favorable a moment ago collapsed into chaos. Gorath stared at the new readings on his command display. His armored hands gripped the railing of his bridge hard enough to crack it. The Erebus had never been just one ship. It was a carrier, and it had just released its children into the dark. Captain Marin watched the Vanguard drones take their positions around the Erebus. She felt the weight of what was about to happen pressing down on her shoulders. 600 ships, thousands of living beings inside them, beings with families and homes and lives that had nothing to do with the decisions of their commanders. She turned to her weapons officer. "Target engines, weapons, and shield generators only. Disable. Do not destroy. Any drone that scores a kill will be flagged for review. Am I clear?" The weapons officer nodded. "Crystal clear, Captain." Marin looked back at the advancing armada. 600 ships coming to kill her and her crew, and her orders were to keep every single one of them alive. Only a human would give that order. Only a human would consider it strength rather than weakness. "All units," she said into the fleet channel, her voice calm and final. "Engage." The Battle of the Velhari Disputed Zone lasted 47 minutes. In the centuries of military history that would follow, scholars and tacticians from every species would study those 47 minutes more carefully than any other engagement in galactic record. Not because of how many died, but because of how few. The combined Velhari-Drunari armada of 612 warships advanced in a wall formation, heavy capital ships at the center, with screens of destroyers and frigates protecting the flanks. It was a classic overwhelming force doctrine, the kind of formation designed to crush a smaller enemy through sheer volume of fire. Against any known opponent in the galaxy, it would have worked. Against the Erebus and its Vanguard swarm, it fell apart in the first 90 seconds. The Vanguard drones did not behave like any fighters or attack craft the alien commanders had ever encountered. Normal fighters attacked in groups, following predictable patterns. The Vanguard moved as one mind. 200 drones acting with a single intelligence, reacting to changes in the battlefield faster than any organic brain could process. When a Velhari destroyer turned to target one drone, 3 others were already behind it, cutting into its engine nacelles with precision laser fire that left the hull intact but burned out the propulsion systems completely. Gorath, watching from the bridge of the Unbroken Fist, screamed orders into the fleet channel. "Concentrate fire on the drones. Ignore the carrier. Kill the swarm first and the mother ship would be helpless." It was a reasonable strategy. It might even have worked if the drones were all he had to worry about. The Erebus moved. For the first time since its arrival, the massive dreadnought broke from its holding position and accelerated toward the center of the armada. It did not move like a ship that size should move. It moved with a terrible, fluid grace that spoke of engines far beyond anything the galaxy had cataloged. It slid through the gaps between enemy formations like a predator wadding through tall grass, and as it moved, its weapons fired. Not all of them, not even most of them. Captain Marin's orders had been specific, and her weapons officers followed them to the letter. Each shot was aimed at a specific system on a specific ship: shield generators, weapon arrays, engine cores. The rail batteries that had punched through two destroyers in the earlier engagement now fired with surgical precision, each round calibrated to disable rather than destroy. It was infinitely harder than simply blowing ships apart. It required better targeting, better intelligence, and better discipline. Humanity had spent 200 years perfecting all three. On the bridge of a Drunari frigate called the Spear of Dawn, the captain watched her shield display collapse to zero, followed immediately by her weapons display, followed by her engines. The ship went dark in the space of 6 seconds. She sat in her command chair, alive and unharmed, floating dead in space while the battle raged around her. Through her viewport, she could see the Erebus passing by, close enough to make out individual hull plates. The human ship did not even slow down. Ship after ship went dark. The pattern was always the same: shields first, then weapons, then engines. Clean, fast, and precise. The Vanguard drones worked the flanks, dismantling destroyers and frigates with coordinated strikes that left crews alive but ships powerless. The Erebus carved through the center, its rail batteries picking off capital ships one by one. The Velhari tried to adapt. They shifted to a tight cluster formation, overlapping their shields to create a combined barrier. The Erebus responded by firing a single concentrated burst from multiple rail batteries simultaneously. The combined shields held for almost 2 seconds before collapsing, and the follow-up shots disabled every ship in the cluster before they could reform. The Drunari tried to run. Their faster ships broke formation and accelerated toward the edge of the zone, hopping to escape and regroup. The Vanguard drones, faster than anything with a living crew, caught them in seconds. One by one, engines flickered and died, and Drunari warships drifted to a halt in the cold dark. 20 minutes into the battle, Goreth Sen realized he was losing. Not just losing, being dismantled. His armada was being taken apart with the careful, methodical patience of a surgeon removing a tumor. Every ship that went dark was one less gun in the fight, and the humans were not losing a single drone. He gathered his remaining capital ships, the heaviest and most powerful vessels in the hegemony fleet, and formed them into a battering ram aimed directly at the Erebus. If he could bring the full firepower of 30 dreadnoughts to bear on the human carrier at point-blank range, surely something would get through those impossible shields. The 30 Velhari dreadnoughts charged. Their combined weapons fire lit up the void like a small star being born. Plasma, neutron beams, kinetic rounds, and experimental weapons that the hegemony had been developing in secret for decades, all focused on a single target. The Erebus took it all. Its adaptive shields shimmered and pulsed, absorbing energies that should have been sufficient to crack a moon. Inside the ship, the shield technicians monitored their systems with calm professionalism. The energy absorption was at 37% capacity. They had room to spare. Captain Marin watched the Velhari dreadnoughts empty everything they had into her ship and felt a familiar ache in her chest. She recognized what Goreth Sen was doing. It was a last stand, a desperate, brave, futile gesture from a warrior who would rather die fighting than surrender. She had seen humans do the same thing 1,000 times throughout history. She respected it. She also could not allow it to succeed. Target all 30 dreadnoughts, she ordered. Simultaneous disabling fire, all forward batteries. The Erebus spoke with 28 voices at once. 28 rail batteries fired in a single coordinated volley. Each round found its target with machine precision. 30 Velhari dreadnoughts, the pride of the hegemony's fleet, went dark in the same instant, like candles blown out by a single breath. Goreth Sen's flagship, the Unbroken Fist, was the last to fall. Its shields, the strongest in the hegemony, held for 3 full seconds longer than any other ship in the fleet. When they finally collapsed and the disabling shots tore through his weapons and engines, Goreth sat in his command chair in the sudden darkness and silence and stared at nothing. He was alive. His crew was alive. His ship was dead, but it was intact. He could not understand it. He had thrown everything he had at the humans, and they had not killed a single one of his people. At the 47-minute mark, the last Drunari frigate lost power and drifted to a stop. The battle was over. Captain Marin stood on her bridge and looked at the tactical display. 612 enemy ships disabled, 0 destroyed, 0 confirmed kills. Her Vanguard drones were already returning to their hangars, undamaged. The Erebus itself had not suffered a single point of hull damage. The bridge was quiet. Her crew did not celebrate. There was nothing to celebrate. They had just fought 600 ships full of living beings who were now floating helpless in the void, dependent on rescue ships to survive. The power that the Erebus carried was not something that made you cheer. It was something that made you careful. Marin opened a broadcast channel. Every ship in the zone, active or disabled, would hear her words. She spoke slowly, clearly, and without anger. "This is Captain Idris Marin of the Terran Warship Erebus. Your crews are alive. Your ships can be repaired. We have disabled your weapons and engines, but your life support systems are intact. Rescue and repair operations may begin immediately. We will not interfere." She paused. This was not a battle. This was a demonstration. The Terran Dominion does not want your territory. We do not want your resources. We do not want your submission or your fear. We want you to stop killing each other over this stretch of space. 400 years is enough. Millions of dead is enough. If you cannot find peace on your own, we will be here to remind you why you should. She closed the channel and stood in silence for a moment. Across the zone, on hundreds of disabled ships, alien crews sat in the dark and listened to her words. Some were angry, some were humiliated, some were afraid. But on more ships than anyone would later admit, the crews felt something unexpected. Relief. 400 years of war, and someone had finally come along strong enough to say stop and kind enough not to kill them when they refused to listen. The Sithon Communion emerged from behind the gas giant within the hour. Their fleet, untouched and fully operational, approached the Erebus with all weapons powered down and all shields lowered. Their senior envoy transmitted a simple message. The Sithon Communion formally requests a ceasefire and offers to participate in Terran-mediated peace negotiations. Marin accepted. On his diplomatic cruiser, Ambassador Thesek Valron stood at his observation window and watched rescue ships moving between the disabled Velhari and Drunari vessels, pulling crews to safety. He had been a diplomat for over 3 centuries. He had seen wars end in every way imaginable, through exhaustion, through genocide, through slow political decay. He had never seen a war end like this. He thought about the casualty report. 0 dead. Humanity had possessed the power to turn 600 warships into dust, and they had chosen, with enormous difficulty and at great risk to themselves, to leave every single crew member alive. Thesek was old enough to know that power meant nothing. Every species in the galaxy had power. What mattered was what you did when you had more power than anyone could stop you from using. That was the true measure of a civilization. By that measure, humanity had just announced itself as something the galaxy had never seen before. The sensor data from the battle reached Axiom Prime 6 hours later. The High Council was still in session when it arrived. Councillor Dreth Morvan watched the recordings in silence, his tail perfectly still. He watched 600 ships go dark without a single death. He watched the Erebus wade through the heaviest fire the hegemony could produce without a scratch. When the recording ended, he quietly withdrew his motion to mobilize the Concordance fleet against humanity. In the silence that followed, someone on the council finally asked the question that had been building in every mind since the Erebus first appeared. It was a small councillor, a Nethuri delegate whose voice was barely above a whisper. How many more ships like the Erebus do the humans have? Nobody answered. Nobody knew. And that silence was louder than anything Counselor Morvan had ever shouted. 3 months passed. The galaxy did not return to normal. It could not. Normal had been broken the moment the Erebus tore through hyperspace, and whatever came next would be something entirely new. The Treaty of Velhari was signed on the observation deck of the Erebus itself. Captain Marin had suggested a neutral location, but all 3 empires had insisted on the human ship. The Sithon said it was symbolic. The Drunari said it was practical, since the Erebus was the most secure location in the sector. The Velhari said nothing at all, but Goreth Sen walked aboard the ship that had defeated his entire fleet without killing a single soldier, and he did so with his back straight and his head high. Whatever else could be said about the Velhari, they respected strength. The treaty was not complicated. The disputed zone would be divided into 3 equal sectors, one for each empire, with shared access to the richest resource systems on a rotating schedule monitored by Terran observers. A demilitarized corridor would run through the center of the zone, open to civilian traffic from all 3 species. Military vessels would be limited in number and armament. Violations would be reported to a joint commission with Terran oversight. 400 years of war ended in a document that was 43 pages long. Captain Marin stood at the far end of the observation deck during the signing ceremony, watching through the tall windows as the stars drifted past. She did not sit at the table. She did not sign the document. She was a witness, not a party. Humanity had not come to claim territory or extract concessions. They had come to stop the killing, and now that the killing had stopped, Marin wanted to make sure everyone understood that the peace belonged to the 3 empires, not to the Terran Dominion. Goreth Sen approached her after the signing. He moved slowly, his massive armored body making the deck plates creak under his weight. He stopped a few meters away and looked at her with his deep-set golden eyes. He did not speak for a long moment. "You could have killed us all," he finally said. His voice was quieter than Marin had expected, not defeated, thoughtful. "Yes," she said. "Why did you not?" Marin turned from the window and looked up at the alien who towered over her by more than a meter. She thought about the question carefully. She thought about the 200 years humanity had spent locked in its own solar system, watching the galaxy through telescope data and intercepted communications. She thought about the wars humanity had fought against itself, the cities burned, the millions lost to violence and hatred and fear. She thought about the long, painful climb from that darkness to something better. "Because we have already been the species that destroys," she said. "We spent a very long time being that species. We are not proud of it, and we decided that if we could not change what we are, we could at least choose what we do with it." Goreth considered this. His armored jaw shifted, a gesture that might have been the Velhari equivalent of a nod. "My people will not forget this, Captain. The Velhari do not forget." "I hope not," Marin said. "That is the point." Far from the disputed zone, on Axiom Prime, the Galactic Concordance was going through its own transformation. The emergency sessions had continued for weeks after the battle, growing quieter and more thoughtful as the initial panic faded and the reality of the situation settled in. Humanity had not attacked the Concordance. They had not issued threats or demands. They had simply shown up at someone else's war, ended it without killing anyone, and then offered to help build a lasting peace. It was, several counselors admitted privately, the most diplomatically sophisticated use of military force in galactic history, and it had been done by a species the Concordance still officially classified as primitive. The vote to rescind the containment policy on humanity passed with an overwhelming majority. Even Counselor Dreth Morvan voted in favor, though he looked like he was swallowing something bitter as he did so. The formal announcement included language about recognizing humanity's advancement and welcoming them into the galactic community, but everyone involved knew the truth. The cage was being opened because the creature inside had already proven it could leave whenever it wanted. Along with the rescission came something unprecedented. The concordance offered humanity a permanent seat on the High Council. In the 8,000 years of the concordance's existence, every species that held a council seat had earned it through centuries of diplomatic service, cultural exchange, and gradual integration. No species had ever been offered a seat outright, but no species had ever done what humanity just did, and the council understood that pretending otherwise would only make them look foolish. Humanity's response surprised everyone. The representative they sent to claim the council's seat was not a general, not an admiral, not a politician or a diplomat in the traditional sense. She was Dr. Lena Vasic, a 53-year-old xenolinguist from a university on Earth who had spent her career studying alien languages and writing academic papers about cross-species communication theory. She was slight, soft-spoken, and wore simple civilian clothing to her first council session. The message was impossible to miss. Humanity had sent a warship first, so they could send a scholar second. Dr. Vasic's first address to the council was brief. She thanked the assembly for the seat. She acknowledged the fear and uncertainty that humanity's arrival had caused. And she made a single promise, that humanity's goal was not dominance but partnership, and that the Terran Dominion would use its capabilities to support peace wherever it could, for as long as it was welcome to do so. The council received her words with cautious silence. Trust would take time, centuries perhaps, but the door was open. Ambassador Thesic Valrun met Dr. Vasic privately after the session. He had requested the meeting, and she had agreed immediately. They sat in a small garden on Axiom Prime, surrounded by alien plants that glowed faintly in the low light. Thesic studied the human woman across from him. She looked nothing like Captain Marin. Where Marin was hard and sharp and controlled, Vasic was warm, her eyes bright with curiosity, her hands moving when she spoke. But there was something underneath that warmth, a steadiness that reminded Thesic that this woman came from the same species that built the Erebus. "I have a question," Thesic said, "one that has troubled me since the battle." "Ask." "Your ship had the power to destroy 600 warships. Your captain chose not to kill a single crew member. The effort required to disable without destroying must have been enormous. It would have been so much easier to simply obliterate the fleet. Why did your people choose the harder path?" Dr. Vasic was quiet for a moment. She looked at the glowing plants around them, and Thesic could see her thinking, not searching for a diplomatic answer, but searching for the true one. "Because we have already burned," she said. "We burned our own world almost to ash before we figured out how to stop. Every weapon on that ship, every piece of technology that the Concordance fears, exists because my species spent 10,000 years perfecting the art of killing each other. We got very, very good at it. We are not proud of that history. It keeps us up at night. It gives our children nightmares." She looked at him directly. "We cannot undo what we are. We carry that violence in our bones, in our history, in the names of our cities. But we decided, a long time ago, that if we could not erase what we had done, we could choose what we did next. And what we chose was this. If we are going to carry all of that terrible power, then we are going to use it to make sure nobody else has to burn the way we did." Thesic sat with those words for a long time. In 300 years of diplomacy, he had heard every kind of speech, every kind of justification, every kind of lie dressed up as principle. He had developed an instinct for false words. Dr. Vasic's words were not false. Months later, deep in Terran space, in a classified shipyard that orbited Jupiter in an orbit hidden from concordant sensors, construction lights illuminated the dark. 12 massive scaffolding structures held 12 new hulls, each one as large as the Erebus, each one bristling with the same rail batteries and adaptive shielding and Vanguard drone bays. They were Erebus-class dreadnoughts, and each one had been given a name. Not a name of a victory or a hero or a myth. Each ship bore the name of a human city that had been destroyed in the old wars. Hiroshima, Dresden, Aleppo, Mariupol, Grozny, Nanjing, Coventry, Mosul, Stalingrad, Vukovar, Phnom Penh, Nagasaki. 12 ships, 12 names, 12 reminders of what humanity had done to itself, carried into the stars not as monuments to victory, but as promises that it would never happen again. Captain Idris Marin stood on the observation deck of the original Erebus, which had been recalled to Terran space for resupply and refit. Through the reinforced glass, she could see the new ships taking shape in the construction lights, their dark hulls glinting with the reflected glow of Jupiter's storms. She had been offered a promotion, Fleet Admiral, command of the entire new task force. She had not yet accepted. Commander Reeves found her there, as he usually did when she was thinking. He stood beside her in comfortable silence for a while, watching the shipyard work. "Big fleet," he said. 12 ships is not a fleet, Commander. It is a statement." He smiled, some statement. Marin did not smile, but something softened in her expression. She thought about Goreth Sen, standing on her observation deck with confusion and respect in his golden eyes. She thought about the Sithon envoy who had been turned away and returned later with an offer of peace. She thought about the hundreds of disabled ships floating in the dark with their crews alive inside them, and the rescue operations that followed, alien hands pulling alien strangers to safety, because the humans had made killing no longer an option. She thought about Dr. Vasic sitting in the Concordance Council chamber, small and soft-spoken, and carrying the hope of an entire species on her shoulders. "What is next?" Reeves asked. Marin looked out at the stars beyond the shipyard, beyond Jupiter, beyond the borders of the solar system that had been humanity's cage for 2 centuries. Out there, she knew, there were other wars, other species trapped in cycles of violence that they could not break on their own. Other stretches of space where beings were dying for reasons that had stopped making sense generations ago. Humanity had spent 10,000 years learning how to fight. They had spent 200 years in a cage, learning how to wait. And now they were building 12 ships named after their worst mistakes, to go out into a galaxy that feared them, and prove that the species born in fire could carry water instead. "We keep going," Marin said quietly. "There is a whole galaxy out there still tearing itself apart, and we have a lot of stars left to visit." Outside the viewport, the construction lights pulsed steadily, and the new ships grew piece by piece in the shadow of Jupiter. The stars beyond them were countless and cold and ancient, and they had watched civilizations rise and fall for billions of years without caring. But something new was moving among them now, something the stars had never seen before. A species that had shattered itself and put the pieces back together wrong, and then right, and then wrong again, over and over, until it finally learned that the breaking was not the end. It was the beginning. The stars had shattered when the Erebus first arrived, but in the silence that followed the thunder, something grew in the cracks. Not an empire, not a conquest. A promise, written in fire and sealed in mercy, that humanity had come to the galaxy not to rule it, but to dare it to be better. And the galaxy, slowly, fearfully, hopefully, was beginning to listen.